The night was still, save for the faint rustling of trees beyond the French windows of the Belvedere Hotel's grand suite. Sir Howard Remington, a British diplomat of formidable reputation, sat alone at his writing desk. A single lamp illuminated the parchment before him. His fountain pen, poised above the heavy vellum. His final treaty, a document that would cement his legacy, required but one last flourish of ink. Yet, as the clock on the mantelpiece chimed midnight, the ink never touched the page. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, casting light upon an inexplicable scene. Sir Howard sat perfectly still, upright in his chair, his lifeless eyes fixed on the ornate chandelier above. No signs of struggle, no broken locks, no visible wounds marred his distinguished frame. A half-written diplomatic document lay in front of him, his signature incomplete. The ink in his pen had dried. His teacup, still warm, rested upon the silver tray brought in the previous evening. The staff discovered him shortly after 7, when his valet, Mr. Pendleton, knocked thrice and entered, expecting to lay out the morning papers. Instead, he let out a strangled cry, drawing the attention of the hotel's manager, Mr. Bartlett, and a handful of guests who had gathered in the corridor. Within the hour, the police had arrived, led by Inspector Craddock of Scotland Yard. Locked from the inside, Craddock muttered. No sign of forced entry. He surveyed the room, the untouched bed, the unruffled carpet, the diplomatic missives stacked neatly by the desk. The windows were latched. The key to the suite rested in Sir Howard's own pocket. "Poison," suggested Constable Wilkes, hovering nervously by the tray. No smell, no residue. If it was devilishly well administered. Craddock approached the desk, glancing at the unfinished signature. Whatever happened, it happened quickly. Mid-stroke. He frowned. Unless... He turned toward the doorway, where Miss Jane Marple stood patiently, clutching her handbag. Dressed in a sensible tweed coat, her gentle blue eyes took in the scene with quiet precision. She had been staying in the adjacent suite pure happenstance, of course, but her reputation in such matters had long since preceded her. "Inspector, I do hope I'm not intruding," she said pleasantly. "It's just that I heard such a commotion and, well, when one finds a diplomat dead in his own quarters, one can hardly help but be curious." Craddock exhaled. "Miss Marple, as much as I'd like to say we've got it all in hand." He gestured at the body, the ink, the untouched tea. "We're staring at a puzzle with no edges." Miss Marple stepped lightly across the threshold, hands clasped together. "Oh dear," she murmured, glancing over the deceased. "Such an untimely end, and in the middle of an important document, too. That's rather dramatic, isn't it?" Her fingers hovered over the paper, a signature that trails off, as if he stopped quite suddenly. Craddock nodded, which means the method was swift, silent. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, and the windows. Quite secure, I imagine. Locked. No sign of anyone leaving? None. Miss Marple pursed her lips. "Then it must be something he ingested," she said, turning toward the tea service. She lifted the cup delicately, sniffed, then set it back down with the slightest shake of her head. No almonds, no bitterness. A clever poisoner might use an odorless agent, but then there ought to be residue in the cup or on the lips. She moved toward the desk, running a gloved finger across the paper. "The ink has dried." He sat like this for hours. Craddock rubbed his chin. "A stroke? Heart failure?" Miss Marple looked up. "Perhaps, but one doesn't usually suffer an episode in such a curiously posed manner. One tends to collapse, don't you think?" Craddock grimaced. "That's what unsettles me. It's like he just stopped." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the documents beside the diplomat's hand. Treaties, reports, personal correspondence. And one thing more, a thin, folded piece of paper with a peculiar emblem. She recognized it at once. A serpent wrapped around a torch. "How odd," she murmured. "This symbol, it reminds me of something." Craddock peered at it. Some diplomatic seal? Miss Marple shook her head. Oh no, dear Inspector, something far more sinister. She turned, glancing once more at the unfinished signature, at the neatness of the death, the locked room, the untouched surroundings. A mystery wrapped in silence. And yet, to Jane Marple, silence was never empty. It always told a story. Miss Marple let the silence settle, allowing the weight of the moment to reveal its subtleties. The unfinished signature, the undisturbed room, the peculiar insignia on the folded paper, each element whispered something to her. Though not yet in full sentences, she had always believed that mysteries were like knitting patterns seemingly tangled, until one unraveled the first loop. Inspector Craddock, ever a practical man, had begun his standard proceedings. The body would be examined by the coroner, the tea service collected for analysis, and statements taken from the hotel staff. As the constables busied themselves, Miss Marple moved with careful deliberation, her gaze lingering on the diplomat's hands, one resting lightly atop the document, the other slightly curled against his lap. "Inspector," she murmured, gesturing toward the desk, "you see how the ink has dried mid-signature? That tells us not only that he died quickly, but also that he was utterly unaware of any danger. He wasn't struggling, nor was he expecting an attack." Craddock nodded. "We considered that. No sign of disturbance, no clear cause of death. But consider this," she continued, tilting her head. "His right hand rests on the document, and his left hand, his dominant hand, I should say, based on the ink stains on his fingers, is curled, as if gripping something that is no longer there." Craddock frowned. "You're suggesting he was holding something that was taken from him?" Miss Marple nodded. "And taken quite deliberately. Now, what would a man writing an important diplomatic document have in his hand, aside from a pen? A letter, perhaps?" Craddock guessed. "Or another document." Miss Marple's fingers trailed lightly along the stack of papers. "A possibility. But if it were only a missing paper, why not simply take the entire pile?" "No, Inspector. This feels selective. And then there's this." She pointed to the small, folded note bearing the serpent and torch insignia. "This symbol is familiar to me, though I can't recall precisely why." Craddock signaled to a constable. "Bag that for examination." Then he turned back to her, arms crossed. "Do you suppose the missing object might have been this very note?" Miss Marple hesitated. "Perhaps. But then, why leave it behind? And more importantly, if the murderer took something from Sir Howard's grasp, why was it so critical to remove it? Yet not these other documents." Before Craddock could respond, a polite cough at the doorway drew their attention. A man in his 50s, with a neatly trimmed moustache and a suit of impeccable cut, stepped inside. His manner was composed, though his eyes held a flicker of concern. "I beg your pardon," he said smoothly. "I am Alfred Hewitt, Under-Secretary to Sir Howard. I was informed of his untimely passing." His gaze swept the room, landing briefly on the desk before returning to Craddock. "This is a most terrible loss. Sir Howard was a brilliant statesman." Craddock extended a hand. "Inspector Dermot Craddock, Scotland Yard. We'll need to ask you a few questions, Mr. Hewitt." "Of course," Hewitt replied, though Miss Marple noted the way his fingers twitched slightly against his sleeve. Craddock wasted no time. "When did you last see Sir Howard?" "Yesterday evening," Hewitt answered. "Around 8 o'clock. We discussed final adjustments to the treaty. He seemed well enough, if a little fatigued. He planned to finalize his notes before retiring." Miss Marple observed him closely. His answers were precise, measured, but something about his stance struck her as unusual. His gaze flickered toward the documents, then away, as if consciously avoiding them. "And this treaty?" she interjected. "Was it particularly contentious?" Hewitt hesitated. "Not contentious, per se, but there were certainly interested parties who may have preferred it altered." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Craddock. "Interested parties?" Such as? Hewitt cleared his throat. I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to say. Craddock's expression darkened. Not at liberty? A man is dead, Mr. Hewitt. Diplomacy is one thing, but we're investigating a murder. Hewitt inclined his head. I understand. But some matters are delicate. I can, however, tell you that Sir Howard had received a troubling note yesterday afternoon, an anonymous warning. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. A warning? How fascinating. And do you know what it said? I did not see it myself, Hewitt admitted. But Sir Howard mentioned it briefly. He dismissed it as nonsense. Unfortunately, it appears he may have been mistaken. Miss Marple turned toward the desk once more. And tell me, Mr. Hewitt, did Sir Howard wear glasses? Yes, Hewitt replied. For reading. Miss Marple nodded. Then where are they? A silence settled over the room. Craddock glanced around, then at the valet, who shook his head. I didn't see them this morning, sir. Pendleton stammered. A peculiar thing, Miss Marple murmured. A man sits at his desk to sign an important document, yet his reading glasses are nowhere to be found. That suggests two possibilities. Either he was interrupted before he could put them on, or someone deliberately removed them. Craddock's frown deepened. If they were taken, it means the killer wasn't just covering their tracks. They wanted to ensure something wasn't seen. Miss Marple smiled slightly. Indeed, Inspector, and I do believe that something is at the very heart of this mystery. Inspector Craddock straightened, his gaze sweeping the room as though expecting Sir Howard's missing reading glasses to materialize from the very walls. The absence of something was often as telling as its presence, and Miss Marple knew this was one of those moments. A deliberate removal of his glasses, of an object he had been holding, hinted at a crime both premeditated and precise. Craddock turned his attention back to Alfred Hewitt. You said Sir Howard mentioned receiving a warning. Who else knew about it? Hewitt hesitated for the briefest of moments. I can't say for certain. I only know he mentioned it to me in passing. It was during a short recess in our discussion, before dinner. Miss Marple, watching him closely, noted how carefully he chose his words. A slight pause before he answered, a measured distance from the details. And yet, she said gently, you did not think it concerning enough to inquire further. Hewitt's lips tightened. Sir Howard was not a man easily rattled. He had spent years in diplomatic service, receiving all manner of threats and warnings. He would not have wanted to indulge paranoia. Craddock jotted something in his notebook. And what about his staff? His valet, Mr. Pendleton, for instance. Would he have been privy to such matters? Hewitt gave a faint shrug. I doubt it. Sir Howard was a private man in such affairs. Pendleton, still standing stiffly by the doorway, shifted uncomfortably. I never heard about any warning, sir. He never mentioned such things to me. Miss Marple turned toward him with a kind smile. And yet, Mr. Pendleton, you must know more about Sir Howard's habits than most. A man's valet is often the keeper of small truths. You say he never discussed such matters with you, but did you notice anything out of the ordinary yesterday? Pendleton wrung his hands. Well, now that you mention it, ma'am, he did seem preoccupied. Not nervous exactly, but deep in thought. He went to his desk right after dinner and didn't wish to be disturbed for the rest of the night. Unusual, that was. Craddock nodded. And who else visited him yesterday? Only Mr. Hewitt, sir, and the hotel staff for his evening tray. I brought him his tea, as always. Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. Ah, yes, the tea. You say it was part of his usual routine? Pendleton nodded quickly. Oh yes, ma'am. Every night, always at 9. He was a man of habit, you see. Miss Marple exchanged a look with Craddock. And was his tea prepared in any particular way? Pendleton looked puzzled. Just the usual. Strong. 1 lump of sugar. No milk. Though, He hesitated. Yes? Miss Marple prompted gently. Well, last night, when I went to collect the tray, I noticed something odd. He'd only taken a single sip. That was unusual for him. Craddock frowned. So he left it almost untouched? Yes, sir. Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully. A curious break in routine. Either he was too distracted, or something about the tea was not to his liking. Craddock gestured to a constable. We'll have it analyzed, just in case. Miss Marple turned back to Hewitt. You see, Mr. Hewitt, when small details do not fit, it is often because someone has altered them deliberately. Which leads us back to the question, who had something to gain from Sir Howard's death? Hewitt exhaled, his composure showing the first signs of strain. With all due respect, Miss Marple, that is not an easy question to answer. Sir Howard was involved in delicate negotiations. The treaty he was drafting had many interested parties, some who stood to benefit, others who stood to lose. Craddock pressed on. Was there anyone he distrusted? Anyone he confided in as a potential adversary? Hewitt hesitated again. There was a man, a foreign attaché, Laurent Deveau. He was seen meeting with Sir Howard yesterday afternoon. Craddock jotted the name down. And what was the nature of that meeting? I don't know exactly, Hewitt admitted. It was private. But I do know Sir Howard was frustrated afterward. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. And yet, you didn't think that relevant before now? Hewitt stiffened. With all due respect, Miss Marple, I am not accustomed to speculating. I provide facts, not assumptions. Miss Marple smiled. Oh, but Mr. Hewitt, you see, speculation is merely the first step toward understanding the truth. At that moment, a hotel staff member arrived with another name to add to the growing list of witnesses. A young woman in her early 30s, impeccably dressed, with striking auburn hair pinned into a neat chignon. Her presence immediately changed the atmosphere of the room. Miss Eleanor Ashford, the staff member introduced. She was dining with Sir Howard last evening. Craddock looked up sharply. Miss Ashford, I assume you were close with Sir Howard. She gave a measured smile. Close is a relative term, Inspector. We were well acquainted. Yes, he was a mentor of sorts. Miss Marple, watching her intently, noticed how her fingers barely touched the pearl necklace at her throat, an unconscious movement, but one that betrayed a flicker of unease. And what did you discuss with him at dinner? Craddock asked. The usual, she replied smoothly. Politics, diplomacy, the state of affairs. He was in good spirits, though somewhat preoccupied. Preoccupied in what way? Miss Marple asked gently. Eleanor hesitated for a fraction of a second. He seemed concerned about something, but he didn't say what. Craddock narrowed his eyes. Miss Ashford, were you aware of any threats or warnings directed at Sir Howard? Her expression remained composed, but a slight tension in her jaw betrayed something beneath the surface. I heard a rumor. A note had been sent, but Sir Howard dismissed it. Miss Marple observed her keenly. You say rumor. Yet you speak as though you knew about it directly. Eleanor's fingers twitched against her pearls once more. Perhaps I overheard something. It wasn't my place to ask. Craddock exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. Miss Ashford, did Sir Howard confide in you about his work? The treaty? Her lips parted slightly, then pressed together. Not in detail. Miss Marple's voice was as gentle as ever. And yet, my dear, you were dining with him on the very night he was drafting it. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Eleanor's face. I assure you, I had nothing to do with what happened. Miss Marple tilted her head ever so slightly. I wonder, Miss Ashford, if you are not holding something back, not out of guilt, but out of fear. Eleanor's breath caught, just for a second, a moment of hesitation, of calculation. The room seemed to still. Inspector Craddock's voice was steady. "Miss Ashford, if there is anything you're not telling us, now is the time." Eleanor's hands clasped together, knuckles whitening. I think Sir Howard knew something," she finally whispered. "Something that could have ruined everything." Eleanor Ashford's whispered words hung in the air, charged with an unspoken weight. Inspector Craddock leaned forward slightly, his pen poised. "And what, exactly, do you believe Sir Howard knew?" Eleanor's lips parted, but she hesitated. Miss Marple observed her carefully, the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her gaze flickered toward the door as if weighing an escape. On the precipice of revealing something crucial, yet fear held her back. "You must understand," she finally said, her voice lower now. "Sir Howard was a man who saw beyond the surface. He understood not just what was being negotiated, but the hidden forces behind it. He was trying to ensure the treaty wouldn't be manipulated for personal gain." Miss Marple gave a small, knowing nod. "Ah, and someone stood to benefit greatly if he failed." Eleanor swallowed. "Yes, there were interests at play, political, financial. But it wasn't just about power. There was something more personal as well." Craddock frowned. "Personal? You mean a grudge?" Eleanor hesitated again, then exhaled. "A betrayal." At that, the room seemed to tighten around them. Craddock set down his pen. "Who betrayed him?" Eleanor shook her head. "I don't know exactly. But yesterday, during dinner, he mentioned that he had uncovered something, a deception that ran deep. He didn't tell me everything, but I could see it troubled him." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was racing. And did he say what he planned to do with this knowledge? Eleanor's fingers traced the pearls at her throat, a nervous gesture she had repeated before. "He said he was going to include a final clause in the treaty, something to ensure that this deception could never come to fruition." Craddock sat back, exhaling sharply. "And yet, before he could sign, he was killed." Miss Marple looked toward the desk, where the unfinished signature still stood frozen in time. "That suggests, Inspector, that his murderer was someone who desperately needed to stop that clause from being written." Craddock nodded. "Then we need to understand what this clause was and who would have wanted it erased." He turned to Eleanor. "Miss Ashford, aside from yourself and Mr. Hewitt, who else knew Sir Howard was working on this final addition to the treaty?" Eleanor hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering. "Laurent Deveau." The name was not unexpected, but its weight deepened the shadows in the room. Craddock tapped his fingers against his notebook. "The French attaché." Eleanor nodded. "Sir Howard met with him yesterday afternoon. After that meeting, he was more unsettled than I'd ever seen him." Miss Marple smiled softly. "And yet, Miss Ashford, you did not mention this until now." Eleanor's face paled. "I was afraid." "Afraid of whom?" Craddock asked. Eleanor hesitated again, her breath coming shallower. "I don't know. But Sir Howard's last words to me were, 'Be careful whom you trust.'" A chill settled over the room. Craddock straightened. "We'll speak to Deveau." Before he could give the order, the door swung open, and a constable stepped in. "Sir, Mr. Deveau is here. He asked to speak with you immediately." Craddock exchanged a look with Miss Marple before nodding. "Send him in." Moments later, Laurent Deveau entered. He was a man of impeccable polish, with a composed expression and a diplomat's practiced ease. He inclined his head. "Inspector Craddock, I understand you have questions for me." Craddock gestured toward a chair. "You met with Sir Howard yesterday." Deveau nodded smoothly. "Yes, a formal discussion." Miss Marple watched him with quiet interest. "And what did you discuss?" Devoe's expression remained unreadable. "The treaty, of course." Craddock didn't flinch. "And the final clause?" Devoe's jaw tensed, almost imperceptibly. "Sir Howard was considering an amendment. He did not share the details with me." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Are you certain of that, Mr. Deveau?" For the first time, something flickered in Devoe's gaze. A calculation. A hesitation. "I believe Sir Howard was being overly cautious," Devoe said carefully. "He saw shadows where there were none." Craddock leaned it in. "And yet, he's dead. Would you call that an overreaction?" Devoe's mouth tightened, but he did not respond immediately. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "Mr. Devoe, a man does not die without reason. If Sir Howard's suspicions were unfounded, then someone went to great lengths to silence an illusion." Devoe exhaled slowly. "Sir Howard was about to make enemies. If he had added that clause, certain individuals would have been disadvantaged." Craddock narrowed his eyes. "Who, specifically?" Devoe hesitated. "I cannot say." Miss Marple watched him closely. "Or will not say." Devoe's lips pressed into a thin line. "There are matters beyond this room that must be considered." Craddock snapped his notebook shut. "A man has been murdered, Devoe. If you know something, withholding it makes you complicit." Devoe met his gaze evenly. "And if I tell you, I put my own life in danger." Silence stretched between them. Miss Marple, ever patient, finally spoke. "Then tell us in a way that does not place you in danger, Mr. Devoe. There are always ways to reveal the truth without speaking it outright." Devoe exhaled through his nose. Then, after a long moment, he said, "Sir Howard believed someone close to him was not who they claimed to be." A ripple of tension moved through the room. Craddock's voice was sharp. "You mean a spy?" Devoe did not confirm nor deny, but his silence was answer enough. Miss Marple's mind whirred. "Then the question, Inspector, is who among Sir Howard's circle had the most to lose if their true nature was exposed?" Craddock's gaze moved from Devoe to Eleanor, then to Hewitt, then finally to Pendleton, who had been standing quietly by the door, nearly forgotten. A bead of sweat glistened on the valet's forehead, and Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Ah," she murmured, "I do believe we are beginning to untangle the web." Inspector Craddock paced the length, all of the drawing room, his expression tight with concentration. Laurent Devoe's words had left an uneasy weight in the air. Sir Howard had suspected someone close to him of deception, a spy, a betrayal, and now, a murder. Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze resting lightly on Mr. Pendleton. The valet, he had remained silent throughout, but his face was drawn, his composure cracking at the edges. The tension broke as a constable entered briskly, clearing his throat. "Sir, we've found something." Craddock turned. "Well?" The constable hesitated, then held out a small, leather-bound notebook. This was hidden in Sir Howard's personal safe. Locked away. Craddock took the book and flipped it open. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, political observations, and most interestingly, a list of names. Some were crossed out, others underlined. At the bottom of the page, one name stood out, hastily scrawled and circled in red: Laurent Devoe. The silence in the room deepened as Craddock lifted his gaze. Devoe had gone completely still. "Well," Craddock said, his voice edged with satisfaction. It seems Sir Howard knew exactly who he was up against. Devoe's composure did not break, but something behind his eyes flickered. "I would advise caution, Inspector. Not everything is as it seems." Craddock let out a humorless laugh. "I think things are quite clear. Sir Howard discovered your true nature, and before he could expose you, you silenced him." Devoe exhaled through his nose. "That is a convenient conclusion." Miss Marple, who had remained quiet, finally spoke. "It is, isn't it?" Her voice, so mild and unassuming, carried a weight that made Craddock pause. The inspector frowned. "Miss Marple?" She smiled gently, tapping a finger against the armrest. "This discovery is remarkably tidy. A hidden notebook containing a single name, written in the very manner one would expect if Sir Howard had uncovered a traitor. But tell me, Inspector, does it not strike you as odd that a man as careful as Sir Howard would leave such an incriminating clue so easily found?" Craddock's brow furrowed. "You think it's planted?" Miss Marple's smile did not waver. It would be a very foolish spy indeed who allows his name to be written down so plainly in a book locked away in his target's safe. Unless, of course, someone wished for us to find it. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Eleanor Ashford let out a quiet breath. But who would have planted it? Miss Marple's gaze flickered toward Pendleton once more. The valet, who had previously been trying to blend into the background, suddenly seemed far too noticeable. Craddock followed her gaze, then turned back to DeVoe. "If you didn't do it, who did?" DeVoe exhaled slowly. "I can only tell you this, Sir Howard was not as alone in his suspicions as you may think." Craddock's grip tightened on the notebook. "And what does that mean?" Before DeVoe could answer, another constable burst into the room, his face flushed. "Sir, we have new evidence." Craddock snapped his head around. "What now?" The constable swallowed. "We found the murder weapon." A murmur went through the room. Craddock stiffened. "Where?" The constable hesitated, then glanced at DeVoe. It was discovered in Mr. DeVoe's personal quarters, hidden beneath a false panel in his travel case. DeVoe didn't react, but the stillness that overtook him was almost more damning than any outburst. Craddock turned back, his face set. "Well, that settles it." The French attaché met his gaze evenly. "Does it?" Miss Marple exhaled quietly, the corners of her mouth turning downward in thought. The room was moving too quickly, the pieces snapping together too perfectly. A hidden notebook, a discovered murder weapon, all pointing to the most obvious suspect. And yet she could not shake the feeling that the real culprit was still watching, still waiting. DeVoe allowed himself a small, knowing smile. "If you arrest me now, Inspector, you will regret it." Craddock straightened. "You're in no position to be issuing threats." "Not a threat," DeVoe murmured. "A fact." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Because the true killer has not finished yet, have they?" Craddock shot her a sharp look. "Miss Marple." She met his gaze with unwavering certainty. "Inspector, think carefully. Someone wants us to believe that Mr. DeVoe is guilty. Someone who has gone to great lengths to direct suspicion onto him. And if they are willing to frame him for murder, what else might they be planning?" The realization was slow, but inevitable. The murderer had silenced Sir Howard to protect a secret. But if the case was declared closed too soon, they would have no reason to stop now. The real danger was not over, and Miss Marple had the distinct impression that another crime was already in motion. Miss Marple sat quietly, her gaze resting on the troubled expressions around the room. Inspector Craddock was pacing again, the supposed breakthrough beginning to crumble in his mind. Laurent DeVoe, the accused, remained still, his composure intact despite the tightening noose around him. Eleanor Ashford had retreated to the edge of the room, arms folded, her face pale. And Pendleton, Pendleton. The ever-watchful valet stood near the door, his presence too carefully neutral. The discovery of the notebook and the murder weapon had seemed decisive, and yet, as Miss Marple had gently pointed out, it was all just a little too neat. A skilled deception, orchestrated by someone who understood how investigations worked. The real question was, why frame DeVoe? She let her gaze drift back to the desk, where Sir Howard's unfinished signature still lingered, a frozen testament to his final moments. A man does not die for nothing. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was always buried in the details. "Inspector," she said softly, "before we move too quickly, I wonder, has anyone examined Sir Howard's personal correspondence? His letters, perhaps?" Craddock frowned. "His secretary, Hewitt, said there was nothing unusual." Miss Marple gave a mild smile. "But perhaps there is something not unusual enough." Craddock sighed, but signaled to the constable. Within minutes, a small stack of Sir Howard's personal letters was produced. Craddock flipped through them with quick efficiency, discarding mundane notes from colleagues and diplomatic exchanges. But then, he slowed, his brow furrowing. He handed one letter to Miss Marple. See what you make of this." The paper was yellowed slightly with age, the ink faded but legible. Miss Marple adjusted her glasses and read, "Howard, I assume you've forgotten our last conversation, but I have not. You should not have ignored me. Some debts remain unpaid, no matter how many years pass. I suggest you consider this before you sign anything. F.R." The note was unsigned beyond the initials, but Miss Marple noted the date 3 months ago. A letter sent well before the treaty discussions had escalated, yet carrying an unmistakable threat. Craddock exhaled sharply. "Who the devil is F.R.?" Laurent Deveau, who had been silent, suddenly spoke. "Francis Rycroft." Craddock turned to him. "And who is that?" Devoe's lips pressed together for a moment. "Then," he said, "a name I had not heard in years. Until now." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Oh, how fascinating. Please, do go on." Devoe's gaze was unreadable. Francis Rycroft was a name whispered behind closed doors in diplomatic circles. A negotiator. Once brilliant, but disgraced. She was caught selling confidential information. Sir Howard was one of the men responsible for exposing her. Craddock straightened. "And now she's returned?" Devoe's mouth twisted. "Perhaps she never left." Miss Marple glanced at the others. Eleanor Ashford was gripping her arms tightly, her expression unreadable. Hewitt, standing stiffly by the fireplace, had gone rather pale. And Pendleton, the ever-quiet valet, had taken half a step backward, just enough to be noticeable. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "I wonder, Inspector, if Francis Rycroft is truly a name of the past, or if she is much closer than we think." Craddock's gaze snapped to Pendleton. You reacted to that name." Pendleton hesitated just a second too long. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Names change over time, don't they? Especially for those who need to disappear." Eleanor let out a slow breath, her expression hardening. "You think Francis Rycroft is here? Among us?" Miss Marple's smile remained. "Oh, my dear, I don't think it. I'm quite certain of it." Craddock stepped toward Pendleton. "Who are you, really?" Pendleton's shoulders stiffened, but he did not answer. Miss Marple, ever patient, simply tilted her head. "A curious thing, isn't it? A valet who keeps to the background but is always listening, who moves in the shadows yet never truly leaves. A person accustomed to watching, to waiting." Pendleton exhaled. "You're making a mistake." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Am I?" Pendleton took a slow step back, his hands curling into fists. And then Miss Marple saw it, the flicker of calculation, the moment before a desperate person makes a choice. She lifted a hand. "Ah, Mr. Pendleton." "I wouldn't." He hesitated. She smiled. "You see, I noticed something rather odd about you earlier. Not your silence, nor your careful movements, but rather the way you reacted when we spoke of spies." Pendleton's jaw tightened. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "You weren't surprised?" "Not in the least." Craddock took another step forward. "Tell me, Pendleton." He glanced at Deveau. "Should I say Rycroft?" A flicker of something, frustration, calculation, flashed in Pendleton's eyes. Then, without warning, he bolted. Craddock swore, lunging after him. The constables followed, boots thudding against the polished floor. Miss Marple simply sighed, folding her hands in her lap. Laurent Deveau gave her a long look. "You knew." She smiled serenely. "A woman does not vanish without a trace unless she learns to become something else. A role, a disguise, one that allows her to move unseen. A valet, after all, is invisible in plain sight." Eleanor Ashford let out a shaky breath. "So, it was never about the treaty." Miss Marple gave a small shake of her head. "Oh, but it was. Only not in the way we assumed. It was never about the negotiations themselves, it was about revenge. A grudge that lingered long past the years of disgrace. Francis Rycroft did not care who won the treaty. She cared only that Sir Howard did not live to see it signed. Craddock re-entered the room, slightly out of breath, but triumphant. "We've got her." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Of course you have, dear." Devoe let out a slow exhale, shaking his head. "You English and your little old ladies." Miss Marple beamed. "Oh, my dear Mr. Devoe. You should know little old ladies see everything." Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her gloved hands resting neatly in her lap, watching as Inspector Craddock and his men led Pendleton Francis Rycroft away. The room was thick with the remnants of tension, but Miss Marple knew better than to believe that the matter was entirely resolved. No. Something still tugged at her mind, something just beyond reach, like a loose thread waiting to be pulled. Laurent Devoe exhaled heavily, running a hand through his dark hair. "So that's it, then?" Rycroft sought revenge on Sir Howard, and in doing so, made a critical mistake. Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "Yes, Mr. Devoe. But I do wonder, was it her mistake, or are we meant to believe it was?" Eleanor Ashford stiffened. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple adjusted her shawl. "It is an old habit of mine, my dear, to notice things that seem just a little too convenient." Her gaze swept the room, lingering for just a moment on the desk. The bookshelf, the chair where Sir Howard had so often Saturday. Francis Rycroft's deception was impressive. She lived undetected for years, biding her time, and yet she made no attempt to flee when the authorities began to close in. It is almost as if she wanted to be caught. Craddock, who had just re-entered, frowned. "She ran." Miss Marple gave him a kind smile. "Yes, but not very well, wouldn't you say?" Craddock scratched his head. "I suppose. But we found the letter, the murder weapon, the motive, it all fits." Miss Marple nodded. "Oh yes, it all fits rather too well." A silence stretched between them. Eleanor Ashford had grown pale again, her hands clenched together. Hewitt, the secretary, remained still, as if trying to fade into the background. And Devoe, Miss Marple observed him keenly, was watching her with a kind of wary fascination. She reached for her knitting bag, retrieving a small bundle of yarn and needles. The soft click-click filled the air as she spoke. "You see, Inspector, I believe we are missing something important, something that has been hiding in plain sight." Craddock sighed. "And what, pray, is that?" Miss Marple glanced up at him. "Tell me, Inspector, how does one forge a signature?" Craddock blinked. "What?" Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. "A signature. It is a deeply personal thing. Wouldn't you agree? Muscle memory takes over. Most people sign their name without thinking. A forgery, however, requires careful attention to detail. And yet, there is always something just a little off." She turned her gaze toward the desk, where Sir Howard's final signature remained, incomplete. "I wonder," she mused, "what would happen if we compared that signature to others in his correspondence?" Craddock's frown deepened. "You're suggesting?" Miss Marple's smile was bright, almost cheerful. "Oh, I'm suggesting nothing, Inspector. I am merely curious." Craddock gave a reluctant nod and gestured for Hewitt to fetch a collection of Sir Howard's signed letters. The secretary moved stiffly, his face carefully neutral as he placed the documents before them. Miss Marple examined them closely. The ink, the slant, the flow of each signature, most were bold and precise, the confident script of a man accustomed to signing official documents. But the one on the treaty, the final, unfinished signature? It was hesitant, uneven. Her eyes twinkled. "Tell me, Inspector, does that look like the signature of a man with a steady hand?" Craddock's expression darkened. "You're saying it's a forgery?" Miss Marple resumed her knitting. "Oh no, dear. Quite the opposite. I am saying it is not his at all." A cold hush settled over the room. Eleanor swallowed hard. "You mean Sir Howard didn't sign it?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "I mean that he tried to, and was stopped before he could finish." Devoe's voice was quiet. "Which means He was alive at the time. Miss Marple nodded. And if he was alive, then perhaps the murder did not occur quite as we assumed. Craddock straightened. Then when, exactly, was Sir Howard killed? Miss Marple smiled. That, Inspector, is precisely what we must find out. She turned her gaze back to Hewitt. Mr. Hewitt, you were the last to see Sir Howard alive, were you not? The secretary hesitated. Yes, I believe so. Miss Marple's knitting continued, steady and methodical. And you recall precisely what he was doing? Hewitt's eyes darted slightly to the side. He was reviewing the treaty. Miss Marple hummed softly. And, yet, we now see he did not complete his signature. A small, nearly imperceptible flicker crossed Hewitt's face. Miss Marple's needles clicked together. Tell me, Mr. Hewitt, do you enjoy mysteries? Hewitt blinked. I what? Miss Marple smiled. Oh, I simply wondered, because it seems to me that you may have created one yourself. Craddock took a sharp step forward. Miss Marple, are you suggesting? Oh no, Inspector, she said cheerfully. I am merely observing. Mr. Hewitt has been very precise in his responses, but there is a certain detail that does not quite align. She glanced at Eleanor Ashford, whose face had gone pale. It is quite simple, Miss Marple said. Frances Rycroft had a grudge, yes, but what if she was not the only one? Devoe inhaled sharply. You think there was another hand at work? Miss Marple smiled sweetly. Oh yes, Mr. Devoe. I do believe this crime has two culprits, and I believe that Mr. Hewitt knows precisely who the second one is. Hewitt's breath quickened. That's preposterous, Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, and yet, Mr. Hewitt, you have not asked me why I think so. The room fell silent. Miss Marple set her knitting down. I do believe, Inspector, that the real murderer is still among us, and they are growing very, very nervous. Miss Marple observed the shift in the room. The moment her suspicions had turned to Hewitt, a near imperceptible panic had flickered behind his otherwise controlled demeanor. It was fleeting, but not unnoticed. She had spent a lifetime recognizing the quiet tremors of guilt. The secretary swallowed, wetting his lips as though to formulate a response. But before he could, Inspector Craddock leaned forward, his voice sharp. Miss Marple, are you saying Hewitt is our man? The elderly woman shook her head gently. Oh no, Inspector. What I am saying is that Mr. Hewitt knows more than he lets on. All eyes fell on the secretary, who stood rigid, his hands clenching at his sides. His hesitation stretched just long enough for Miss Marple to know he was calculating, deciding how best to maneuver. Then, with a carefully measured breath, he straightened his posture. I assure you, I have been entirely truthful, he said smoothly. I was simply in shock, as any man would be when accused of something so vile. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Oh dear me, no one has accused you of anything, but it does trouble me how eager you are to clarify your innocence when I have not yet made any claims at all. A flicker in his expression. Before the tension could escalate further, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the corridor. A uniformed constable burst in, slightly out of breath, his eyes darting toward Craddock. Sir, there's been an incident. Craddock's brow furrowed. What sort of incident? The constable hesitated, clearly aware of the weight of his next words. The evidence, sir. The treaty with the forged signature. It's gone. A heavy silence fell. Craddock's face darkened, and he spun toward the constable. Gone? What do you mean, gone? The young officer shifted uncomfortably. I mean stolen, sir. The evidence room was locked, as always. But when Sergeant Wilkes went to retrieve the document just now, the folder was missing. No sign of forced entry. Miss Marple let out a soft hum of consideration. How very fascinating. Craddock was less composed. He swore under his breath and turned toward the assembled group. No one is leaving this house until I get to the bottom of this. Someone is trying to cover their tracks. Laurent Devoe frowned. But who could have done it? We have been here the whole time. Miss Marple glanced at Hewitt, whose fingers were now curled tightly into his palms. Oh yes, it does make one wonder, doesn't it? Eleanor Ashford exhaled sharply, rubbing her temple. This is absurd. First, a forged signature. Now a stolen document who would go to such lengths. If Frances Rycroft was guilty, why would someone need to erase the evidence against her? Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Unless, of course, the document did not truly incriminate her at all, but rather pointed to someone else. Craddock turned on his heel. We need to search everyone here. Someone had access. His men moved swiftly, checking pockets, briefcases, and personal belongings. But nothing turned up. Whoever had taken the document had already disposed of it or had yet to reveal it. Miss Marple sighed, picking up her knitting once more. A most unfortunate turn of events, wouldn't you say, Mr. Hewitt? Hewitt's voice was steady, but there was an undeniable edge to it. I suppose it is. She looked at him thoughtfully. Tell me, when did you last see the document? Hewitt's hesitation was nearly imperceptible. When the inspector took possession of it, of course. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes. But you were present when it was first discovered. Were you not? I was, Hewitt confirmed, his voice careful now. And you handled it, if I recall. There was another pause, only briefly. I set it aside when I found it on Sir Howard's desk. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Then you would have had the perfect opportunity, wouldn't you? He inhaled sharply. Opportunity for what? Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. Why, to alter it, of course. Or, if that was too risky, to ensure it was later stolen. After all, if the document had something on it that might contradict the forged signature, perhaps another mark, another indication that Sir Howard was interrupted, then it would be rather inconvenient for it to be examined too closely, wouldn't it? The room was utterly still. Craddock's expression hardened. Are you implying Hewitt tampered with it before we ever retrieved it? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Oh, not just tampered with it. Inspector, I believe he knew from the very start that the treaty was a false lead. Hewitt's face had grown pale. Miss Marple smiled. A missing document is a most interesting thing. Its absence creates more confusion than its presence ever could. And confusion, you see, is the perfect cover for guilt. Hewitt's throat worked as he tried to find a response, but before he could, there was a sudden commotion outside. A second constable entered, looking flustered. Inspector, sir, we just found the remains of the treaty. Craddock tensed. Where? The officer hesitated. In the fireplace, sir. Someone burned it. A murmur of shock rippled through the group. Craddock wasted no time. Check everyone's hands for ink or soot. Someone did this recently. Miss Marple, however, was watching Hewitt. The secretary had not moved. His face was still, composed, but too composed. Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and pulled out a folded lace handkerchief. She held it out toward him. For your hands, dear. Hewitt blinked. I beg your pardon. Her voice was almost too kind. They are trembling, Mr. Hewitt. He exhaled, forcing himself to steady, but the subtle shake remained. Miss Marple sighed. It is always the smallest things, you know. The way a person holds their hands, the way they avoid looking at something directly. You had an opportunity to steal the treaty before it could be properly examined. But when the authorities took possession of it, you knew you had only one option left. She glanced toward the fireplace. Destroy it before anyone could notice what was truly there. Hewitt's jaw clenched. This is absurd. Craddock stepped forward. Is it? Because I'm beginning to think Miss Marple is right. You had access to that document from the start. You knew exactly what it contained. And then, when you realized it could lead us to the truth, you got rid of it. A pause. Then, Hewitt took a slow step back, his breath quickening. You have no proof. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. Not yet, but we will. Hewitt's expression flickered an instant of fear, of calculation. Then, before anyone could stop him, he bolted. Hewitt bolted toward the corridor, his footsteps pounding against the polished wooden floor as he shoved past the stunned onlookers. Inspector Craddock reacted a second too late, barking out an order as his men scrambled in pursuit. "After him! Don't let him out of your sight!" Miss Marple remained where she was, watching with an expression of quiet inevitability. There was always a moment like this, the moment when guilt, long restrained, burst free in a reckless attempt to escape its fate. But she knew, just as surely as she knew how to knit a perfect stitch, that running only ever led to one thing: the truth. A sharp cry echoed down the hall, followed by the sound of a heavy crash. A constable's voice rang out, urgent. "Inspector, over here!" Miss Marple and the others hurried after them, finding themselves in the grand drawing room at the far end of the estate. The sight that met them was a tableau of chaos. Hewitt lay sprawled on the floor, his breath coming in shallow, wheezing gasps. His eyes were wide with shock, his hands clutching at his chest. Craddock dropped to his knees beside him. "What happened?" The constable, who had been closest to the chase, shook his head, bewildered. "He was running, sir." Then suddenly, he just collapsed. Miss Marple stepped forward, peering down at the fallen man with a slight furrow of concern. Hewitt's lips had taken on a bluish tinge. He struggled to speak, but only a faint, rasping breath escaped. Craddock turned sharply to his men. "Get the doctor, now!" One of the constables bolted from the room, but Miss Marple had already crouched beside Hewitt, her sharp eyes sweeping over him with practiced care. A sudden, unexplained collapse. The gasping breaths, the trembling fingers, just moments earlier. She had seen such symptoms before. "Hewitt," she said softly, but with urgency, "did you eat or drink anything recently?" His eyes flickered toward her, but his breath was too weak for words. Instead, his fingers curled, as though trying to grasp at something unseen. Craddock cursed. "Poison! Someone got to him first." A murmur of shock rippled through the gathered guests. Eleanor Ashford brought a hand to her mouth. But how? He was with us the whole time." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the nearest table, where a small silver tray held a half-empty glass of brandy. The realization struck her instantly. "Not the whole time," she murmured. "Someone prepared for this. They anticipated that Mr. Hewitt might run." Craddock followed her gaze. "You think he drank from that glass before he fled?" She nodded. "It seems likely, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe we will find traces of something rather sinister in that brandy." One of the constables took up the glass carefully, while another ran to fetch the doctor, but it was clear from the way Hewitt's body had begun to relax his fight, leaving him, that it would be too late. His chest rose in one last shallow breath, then stilled entirely. Eleanor let out a choked gasp. Laurent Deveau took a slow step back, shaking his head. Craddock exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Blast it! He knew something, and now he's taken it to the grave. Miss Marple remained still, watching Hewitt's lifeless form with quiet contemplation. Not taken, Inspector, silenced. Craddock looked at her sharply. "You think this was deliberate?" She offered a patient smile. "Poisoning a drink is never an accident, dear. Someone was afraid of what he might say. And that means we are closer to the truth than ever." The inspector let out a slow breath. "Then we need to move fast. Whoever did this is still among us." Miss Marple turned to face the remaining guests, her expression as mild as ever, but her eyes sharp. The tension in the room was palpable. Someone here had orchestrated not just a forgery, not just a theft, but now murder. And despite their best efforts, they had only drawn the noose tighter around themselves. "Yes," she said softly, her fingers resuming their slow, steady work on her knitting. "We mustn't give them the chance to strike again." Miss Marple sat in the drawing room, her hands calmly occupied with her knitting, though her mind was far from the rhythmic motion of the needles. The room had emptied somewhat after the chaos of Hewitt's sudden death, leaving only Inspector Craddock, a handful of constables, and the remaining guests, who lingered in uneasy silence. The brandy glass had been sent away for testing, but Miss Marple already suspected they would find traces of something rather nasty, a fast-acting toxin, administered with careful precision. She glanced toward the fireplace, where Laurent Deveau stood with his arms crossed, his face shadowed in the dim light. Eleanor Ashford sat stiffly in a chair, her hands knotted together in her lap, while Lord Ainsley paced near the window, his usual air of arrogance replaced by something more unsettled. Miss Marple's gaze flicked over each of them, her mind sifting through the events of the past hours. The diplomat's murder, the forged treaty, Hewitt's sudden attempt to flee, and now his untimely death. It was a tangled web, but she had unraveled far worse. And then, like the final stitch of a long and complicated pattern, a single detail clicked into place, a misplaced object. It had been so minor at the time, a detail so easily overlooked, yet now, in light of Hewitt's death, it carried new weight. She set her knitting aside. "Inspector," she said mildly, "I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment." Craddock, who had been speaking in hushed tones with one of his men, turned. "What is it, Miss Marple?" She smiled gently. "I believe we have been looking at this rather backwards. We have been considering motive and opportunity, of course. But I believe the answer is in something quite simple, an object that was not where it should have been." A flicker of intrigue crossed his face. "Go on." She folded her hands in her lap. "You recall the ink bottle in Sir Geoffrey's study?" He frowned. "The one knocked over on his desk?" "Precisely." Her eyes glimmered. "At the time, we assumed it was the result of a struggle, but I recall quite clearly that the ink stain was still wet when we first entered the room, which means it had been knocked over recently, perhaps only moments before we arrived." Craddock's brows furrowed. "But if the struggle had happened earlier when Sir Geoffrey was attacked, then the ink would have dried by the time he was found." Miss Marple nodded. "Marple, which suggests, dear Inspector, that someone was in that study after the murder, tampering with something." A hush fell over the room as everyone absorbed the implication. Eleanor let out a small, startled breath. "But why?" Craddock pressed. "What would they have needed to change?" Miss Marple's gaze settled on Lord Ainsley. "That, I believe, is the crucial question, and I rather think our answer lies with the forged treaty." Ainsley stiffened. "Are you implying that I—" Miss Marple lifted a hand, ever polite. "Not necessarily you, Lord Ainsley. But consider the timing. We know that Sir Geoffrey was killed, and then afterwards someone entered his study and disturbed the ink bottle. Perhaps, I dare say, to ensure that a very particular document was among his papers." Laurent Deveau spoke then, his voice sharp. "The treaty, the forgery, someone planted it after the fact to frame Sir Geoffrey as a traitor." Miss Marple smiled approvingly. "Precisely, Mr. Deveau. And that tells us something very important, does it not?" Craddock exhaled, shaking his head. "The murderer wasn't just covering up a crime, they were creating a deception, making it appear as though Sir Geoffrey had signed that document of his own volition before he died." His eyes darkened. "Which means the forgery wasn't the motive for the murder. It was a cover story." Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. "And now, with Mr. Hewitt so conveniently silenced, I think we can safely assume that we are dealing with someone both meticulous and desperate, someone who could not afford for the truth to come out." She watched as Lord Ainsley's hand tightened around the arm of his chair, as Eleanor Ashford's throat bobbed with an anxious swallow, as Laurent Devaux's gaze flickered with something unreadable. Then she smiled. "Fortunately," she said gently, "the truth has a way of making itself known." Miss Marple observed the room with a quiet intensity, her knitting now forgotten in her lap. The weight of her last statement had settled heavily upon the group, each person reacting in their own telling way. Lord Ainsley's aristocratic composure had grown brittle, his fingers gripping the chair's arms as though bracing against a storm. Eleanor Ashford's anxious swallow, the way her hands twisted together, suggested the gnawing weight of knowledge unspoken. And Laurent Devoe, his sharp, unreadable gaze, was as tightly controlled as ever. Yet something had shifted. There was tension in his posture, a careful rigidity. Inspector Craddock studied them all in turn, then exhaled sharply. So, we're dealing with more than just a diplomatic forgery. The entire narrative surrounding Sir Geoffrey's death was orchestrated, his reputation deliberately tainted post-mortem. He crossed his arms, which means we need to ask a different question. Who stood to benefit the most from that deception? Miss Marple's expression remained composed, but a spark of understanding had fully ignited within her. Precisely, Inspector. The true motive here is not just about espionage or international scandal. No, it is something far more personal, something that demanded not only Sir Geoffrey's death, but also the destruction of his legacy. A hush settled. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in the heavy silence. Then Lord Ainsley let out a brittle laugh, though it held no humor. "You make it sound almost poetic, Miss Marple," he said, though his voice was tight. "Murder is rarely so grand as you suggest. If someone wanted Sir Geoffrey dead, surely it was for something far more tangible: power, money, perhaps simple self-preservation." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, watching him with eyes as sharp as they were kind. "But you see, my dear Lord Ainsley, the best deceptions are the ones that feel practical, that appear motivated by simple greed or necessity, when, in reality, the truth is something altogether different, something rooted not in politics or financial gain, but in the deepest recesses of human emotion." Eleanor Ashford made a faint noise, as though she wanted to speak but dared not. Devoe remained silent, unreadable. Craddock's brow furrowed. "Emotion?" he considered. "Revenge, then?" Miss Marple gave the smallest of smiles. "A particular kind of revenge, yes, one that has been quietly simmering for many, many years." A silence stretched, thick with unspoken truths. Then, quite suddenly, Eleanor Ashford let out a sharp breath, her hands trembling. "I think," she said in a strained voice, "I need a drink." She rose from her seat with unsteady grace, moving toward the sideboard. Ainsley watched her, his mouth pressed into a thin line. "You may as well pour one for all of us," he muttered. Miss Marple remained seated, unhurried, but her gaze never left Eleanor. "You knew, didn't you?" Eleanor froze for only half a second, but the hesitation was enough. "Knew what?" she asked, her voice too casual. "The real reason Sir Geoffrey was murdered." The glass in Eleanor's hand clinked against the decanter. She inhaled slowly before turning around, the brandy untouched. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "You do, my dear, because this was never just about the treaty. That was merely a convenient pretext, a way to disguise something much older, much more painful." Eleanor's throat bobbed. "And what exactly do you believe this was about, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple sighed softly, her fingers resting lightly on the wool of her knitting. "It was about love and betrayal, and a child who was cast aside, left to suffer in the shadow of a father who refused to acknowledge them." The air in the room seemed to still. Lord Ainsley stiffened. "What are you talking about?" Miss Marple's gaze turned to Laurent Devoe. He had remained silent through it all, his sharp features unreadable, but there was something in the tautness of his jaw, in the way his fingers had curled against his sleeve. "I am speaking of you, Mr. Devoe," she said quietly. A faint flicker of something crossed his face, surprise, perhaps, but not disbelief. Craddock turned sharply toward him. "What?" Devoe exhaled slowly, then offered a small, weary smile. "Ah, so you see it now, madame." Eleanor made a strangled sound. Lord Ainsley's lips parted slightly, but no words came. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, I see it now. You are not merely a diplomat, Mr. Devoe. You are Sir Geoffrey's son." A deep silence followed. Devoe's lips twitched faintly, as if debating whether to deny it, but then he let out a breath and inclined his head. "We, that much is true." Craddock looked between them in disbelief. Sir Geoffrey had an illegitimate son? Miss Marple's voice remained soft. A son he refused to acknowledge. A child born to a woman he discarded, left to fend for herself. And that child grew up with only one certainty, that he would never be accepted into the world his father belonged to. Lord Ainsley let out a scoffing breath. "You're saying this was all some long-planned revenge scheme?" "That's absurd." Miss Marple turned her gaze to Devoe. "Is it?" Devoe chuckled lowly. "Not revenge, exactly. At least, not at first. I did not come to England seeking his death, Miss Marple. But I did come seeking acknowledgement. A reckoning, if you will." His voice hardened slightly, and when I realized he would never give me that, not even privately, not even in death, well, I suppose I lost patience. Craddock's jaw tightened. "So you killed him?" Devoe exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "No, Inspector, I did not." Craddock frowned. Then Miss Marple's voice was barely above a whisper. "Eleanor." Eleanor's breath hitched. Lord Ainsley turned to her sharply. "Eleanor?" Her eyes were brimming with unshed tears. "He was going to ruin Laurent," she said hoarsely. Even after all these years, after everything, he still refused to see what he had done, how much damage he had caused. He had no remorse. Her voice cracked. "I couldn't let him destroy Laurent too." Silence. Miss Marple sighed. "And so, to protect the man you loved as a son, you ended the father who had abandoned him." Eleanor shuddered. "Yes." Craddock's voice was grim. "And Hewitt?" A shadow crossed her face. "He found out. He tried to blackmail me. I didn't mean for him to die. I only meant to—" She stopped herself. But the damage was done. The truth had finally unraveled. And in the quiet that followed, Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, the weight of understanding settling upon her. The crime had not been about power, nor money, nor even politics. It had been about a son seeking his place in the world, and a woman willing to kill to give it to him. Miss Marple sat in the drawing room, her fingers idly smoothing over the wool of her knitting. The truth had been laid bare, but the work was not yet finished. Eleanor sat across from her, hands clasped tightly in her lap, her entire body rigid with the weight of her confession. Inspector Craddock stood by the window, watching her with the careful gaze of a man who knew the moment of reckoning had arrived. And yet, something still did not sit right. "There's something I don't understand, Miss Ashford," Craddock finally said, his voice measured. "If this was all to protect Laurent Devoe, why not leave well enough alone? Sir Geoffrey was already dead, his influence over Laurent ended. Why risk everything by killing Hewitt?" Eleanor exhaled shakily, her fingers twisting together. "Hewitt, he knew too much. He threatened to expose the truth about Laurent's parentage about me, and once the scandal reached the papers, Laurent's reputation would be ruined." Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes did not waver. "But you see, my dear, that's precisely what doesn't make sense. If your only concern was protecting Laurent, you could have silenced Hewitt in a less final way. No, this wasn't just about Laura. Was it?" Eleanor's breath hitched. Lord Ainsley, who had remained quiet for some time, now leaned forward, his voice low. "Eleanor, what have you done?" A flicker of something passed across her face, fear, regret, but also defiance. "I did what was necessary," she murmured. Sir Geoffrey had no remorse, no shame for what he had done. He was content to let his son remain in the shadows while he played the honorable statesman. I couldn't bear it. And Hewitt, she closed her eyes briefly. He wanted money, of course. He always did. But he also wanted something else, something worse. He said he had proof that Geoffrey had done more than abandon Laurent, that he had ensured his mother suffered for daring to bring him into the world. Laurent Deveau, who had remained silent until now, let out a quiet breath. "I always suspected," he murmured. "My mother never spoke of him. Never. But there was a sadness in her, a wound that never healed." Craddock's jaw tightened. "So you killed Hewitt to keep that secret buried?" Eleanor's eyes darkened. "I killed him because he was no better than Geoffrey. He was willing to sell that truth to the highest bidder. He wanted to profit from suffering." Miss Marple sighed, her knitting now still in her lap. "You believed yourself, judge and executioner, Miss Ashford. But in the end, the past cannot be rewritten by blood." Eleanor let out a hollow laugh. "And yet, it is rewritten all the time, isn't it? History favors those who shape it. I simply ensured that Geoffrey Ainsley's legacy would not be one of lies." Craddock took a step forward. "Eleanor Ashford, I'm placing you under arrest for the murders of Geoffrey Ainsley and Hugh Hewitt. Anything you say." A flash of motion, the sound of shattering glass. Before anyone could react, Eleanor moved with shocking speed, grabbing a letter opener from the side table and swinging it toward Craddock. He barely managed to step back in time, the blade slicing through the fabric of his coat instead of flesh. Laurent lunged forward, gripping Eleanor's wrist, his strength easily overwhelming hers. "No more," he said, his voice thick with sorrow. "This ends now." Eleanor's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, her eyes darting between them. "I only wanted justice," she whispered. Miss Marple shook her head. "Justice is not ours to take so easily, my dear." Eleanor's body sagged, and the fight left her all at once. Craddock stepped in, securing her hands with a steady grip as he pulled out his handcuffs. As the final click of metal sealed her fate, the room fell into a deep, uneasy silence, and Miss Marple, ever composed, simply resumed her knitting, as if the final stitch in the mystery had at last been placed. As the handcuffs clicked shut around Eleanor Ashford's wrists, the tension in the room seemed to break, like the first breath after a storm. Inspector Craddock straightened his coat, glancing at the torn fabric where her blade had nearly found its mark. Laurent Deveau, his face ashen, turned away from Eleanor, his hands gripping the back of a chair as if he might collapse without its support. Lord Ainsley remained seated, his expression unreadable, while Miss Marple resumed her knitting with quiet precision, as though the affair had reached its inevitable conclusion. And yet, something tugged at the edges of her mind, a feeling, a whisper of doubt, the sense that a stitch had been dropped somewhere in the tapestry of events. She glanced up, her sharp blue eyes scanning the room, watching faces, movements, breath. It was then that she saw it. Laurent Deveau stood rigid, his shoulders trembling, but it was not grief that Miss Marple saw tightening his jaw. It was not sorrow making his fingers twitch. No, it was something else entirely, suppressed rage, barely contained, a storm that had not yet broken. Eleanor, despite her capture, looked at him not with betrayal, nor even regret, but with something softer, pity. Miss Marple's fingers stilled on the wool. A chill crept up her spine. She had made a terrible mistake. "Inspector," she said suddenly, her voice calm but firm, "do be so kind as to hold off on taking Miss Ashford away just yet." Craddock turned to her, brow furrowed. "Miss Marple, I assure you, the case is not as neatly tied up as you might think, my dear Inspector," she said gently. "I believe we are missing the final, most crucial piece." Eleanor's lips parted, and for the first time that evening, her composure faltered. "Miss Marple," she started. The elderly woman shook her head slightly, a knowing look in her eyes. "You were willing to take the blame for Sir Geoffrey's murder. You even killed Hewitt yourself." "I have no doubt. But what I do doubt, my dear, is that you were the one who truly sought revenge for Sir Geoffrey's sins." Laurent let out a breath, a slow, deliberate thing. "What are you saying?" he asked carefully. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "I am saying, Monsieur Deveau, that while Miss Ashford may have taken it upon herself to silence Hewitt, she did not kill Sir Geoffrey Ainsley. The room froze. Craddock's head jerked up. "Miss Marple, be careful with what you're suggesting." "Oh, but I am always careful, Inspector. Just as careful as the true murderer has been throughout this entire affair." She tilted her head. "Isn't that right, Monsieur Deveau?" Laurent's lips parted slightly, a half-second too long of hesitation, a half-breath before the denial. "You're mistaken," he said, shaking his head. "Eleanor already confessed." "She confessed because she thought she was protecting you," Miss Marple interrupted, "and you let her. But she is not the one who laced Sir Geoffrey's wine with cyanide. That, my dear, was you." A sharp gasp from Lord Ainsley. "Laurent? No, surely not." "Sir Geoffrey abandoned him," Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but relentless. "He lived his whole life knowing that his father had not only denied him, but actively sought to erase his existence. And when Sir Geoffrey finally returned to England, he brought with him the possibility of exposure, the fear that his secrets might come to light at last. What better time to exact justice than when the man himself was within arm's reach?" Laurent's expression darkened, and for the first time that evening the mask slipped. "He deserved it," he said softly. Eleanor shut her eyes. "Laurent, no." He turned to her, something bitter curling at the edge of his mouth. "You think you understand, Eleanor, but you don't. You did this for me. Yes, but you never truly knew what it was like. To live knowing the man who should have been your father saw you as a mistake, to watch my mother work herself to exhaustion just so I could have a future while he lived in luxury, pretending I didn't exist." His eyes burned with something fierce, something raw. "He ruined my mother's life. I simply returned the favor." A heavy silence settled in the room. "And yet, you let Eleanor take the blame," Miss Marple said quietly. Laurent's gaze flickered. "She had already killed Hewitt." "Yes, she finished for him. And you saw an opportunity, didn't you? Let the authorities believe she had committed both murders. After all, what was one more crime to add to the tally?" Craddock stepped forward now, his hand hovering near his revolver. "Is that true, Deveau?" he demanded. "Did you kill Sir Geoffrey?" Laurent's hands flexed at his sides. For a moment, it seemed as though he might try to run. But then, something inside him caved. He let out a slow breath, the fight draining from his body. His shoulders sagged. "Yes," he murmured. "I killed him." Eleanor let out a quiet, pained sound. "Laurent," Miss Marple sighed, shaking her head. "You could have lived your life free of him, my dear, free of his shadow. But instead, you became ensnared by it. And in trying to undo his legacy, you have only ensured that yours will be tied to his forever." Laurent did not respond. He merely turned, extending his wrists toward Craddock in silent acceptance. The inspector hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward, fastening the second pair of cuffs around his wrists. "Laurent Deveau, you are under arrest for the murder of Sir Geoffrey Ainsley." As the weight of those words settled over the room, Miss Marple looked to Eleanor, whose expression was hollow. "You were willing to sacrifice everything for him," she said gently. Eleanor met her gaze, something shattered behind her eyes. "He was all I had left." Miss Marple nodded solemnly. "And yet, love built on deception is a fragile thing indeed." With that, Craddock led Laurent away, his footsteps heavy against the wooden floor. Eleanor followed close behind, her fate now intertwined with his in a way she had never intended. As the door closed behind them, Lord Ainsley let out a slow breath, his face lined with weariness. "You truly are remarkable, Miss Marple." She offered him a small, knowing smile, then resumed her knitting. "Oh, not at all, my dear. I merely pay attention." And as the final loop of yarn was threaded into place, so too was the last piece of the mystery, tight, seamless, inescapable. As Lord Ainsley was led away in handcuffs, a heavy silence filled the room. The weight of his confession still hung in the air, its echoes stretching into every corner of the grand estate. Laurent stood motionless, his face pale with disbelief, while Eleanor slowly sank into a chair, her eyes unfocused, as if struggling to grasp the reality of what had just unfolded. The case was closed. And yet, the conclusion felt strangely hollow. Inspector Craddock exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Well, I suppose that's that," he muttered, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Miss Marple, however, continued knitting, her needles clicking softly, her eyes keenly observant. "Is it, though?" she mused, glancing toward the decanter, still sitting on the table, the remnants of brandy within catching the dim light. Craddock frowned. Ainsley confessed. "That's as good as a signed statement." "Confession. Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But motive?" She turned her gaze toward Laurent, who was still standing stiffly near the window, his hands clenched into fists. "Laurent, dear, what is it that troubles you?" Laurent's jaw tightened. "He said he did it for me," he said, voice strained. "That's what doesn't sit right. Ainsley wasn't the kind of man to act out of love or guilt. He always had an agenda." His gaze lifted to meet Miss Marple's, dark with uncertainty. What if this was part of it? Eleanor's head snapped up. "You think he wanted to get caught?" Craddock let out an exasperated sigh. "Now wait just a moment, let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be." But Miss Marple merely smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, I do think it is precisely as complicated as it needs to be." She set her knitting down and folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Let us consider what we know, shall we? Sir Geoffrey Ainsley was poisoned. The brandy, as we determined, was laced with cyanide." She nodded toward the table. "The bottle was untouched, which means the poison was in his glass, not the decanter." Craddock sighed, clearly impatient. "Yes, and Ainsley admitted to putting it there." "Ah, but did he?" Miss Marple's expression remained pleasant, but there was a sharpness beneath it. "What did he actually say?" The room fell silent as they considered this. Eleanor's brow furrowed. "He admitted to poisoning Geoffrey. He said he had to. That Geoffrey was a monster." Laurent's eyes darkened. "But he never actually described how he did it, did he?" Craddock's face hardened. "You think he was covering for someone?" Miss Marple resumed knitting, her fingers deftly weaving the yarn into a tight, intricate pattern. "Let's say, hypothetically, that Lord Ainsley wanted Geoffrey dead, but not by his own hand. Suppose he found a way to orchestrate it so that the real murderer was never suspected." Eleanor stiffened. "Then who?" Her voice cut off abruptly, and all the color drained from her face. Craddock turned to her sharply. "What is it?" Miss Marple's hands stilled, and she looked at Eleanor with quiet understanding. "Oh, my dear, I see you've realized it as well." Laurent's gaze flickered between them. "Realized what?" Eleanor swallowed, her lips parting slightly. "The brandy. Her voice trembled. "I poured it." The room turned ice cold. Craddock's expression darkened. "You're saying—" Eleanor shook her head violently. No, I didn't poison him. I swear to you, I had no idea. He asked me to pour him a drink, so I did. That's all." Laurent's hands trembled. "Then who?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "There's only one person left who could have done it." A slow, dreadful realization crept over Eleanor's face. She turned, almost unwillingly, toward the door where Lord Ainsley had last been seen. Laurent's voice was barely above a whisper. "He set you up." Miss Marple gave a solemn nod. "Oh yes, quite neatly, I'd say." Craddock's jaw clenched. "He was never planning to take the fall, was he?" Miss Marple let out a small, wistful sigh. "No, Inspector, I don't believe he was. I believe he intended to feign guilt, knowing full well that Eleanor would realize the truth once it was too late. A noble act of sacrifice, appearing to take the blame while in reality, he planted a seed of doubt that would sprout just at the right moment. Laurent's hands curled into fists. That bastard! He knew she'd figure it out. Eleanor's voice was barely a breath. And when I did, it would be my word against his. Miss Marple nodded. And as we all know, it is terribly difficult to prove what one didn't do. Craddock turned sharply toward the door. We need to get him back. He barked an order to the constables outside. Find him. Now. But even as the officers rushed out, Miss Marple remained still, her expression knowing. He's already gone, Inspector. Craddock exhaled through gritted teeth. Damn it. Laurent raked a hand through his hair, pacing the length of the room. So what do we do now? If we can't prove it, he'll get away with it. Eleanor pressed her hands to her face, taking a shaky breath. This is my fault. I should have known. Miss Marple's voice was steady, reassuring. You were manipulated, my dear, not complicit. There is a very great difference. Laurent shook his head. But he's out there. And he won't stop. Miss Marple's expression was calm, but there was a sharpness to her eyes. No, I rather think he won't. Craddock exhaled. So he's still out there. Watching. Waiting. Eleanor closed her eyes, a shiver running down her spine. And we don't know when he'll strike again. Miss Marple's knitting resumed, her voice quiet but resolute. No, but we will be ready when he does. The soft hum of conversation had long since faded, leaving only the distant murmur of the wind against the manor's grand windows. A lingering tension still clung to the air, a ghost of the revelations that had unfolded within those walls. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting needles moving in steady, rhythmic clicks. The case was closed at least. That was what Inspector Craddock had insisted before departing into the night, his team combing the countryside for Lord Ainsley. Eleanor had gone to bed, pale and shaken. Laurent had followed soon after, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. And yet Miss Marple remained in the sitting room, her thoughts tangled in the final threads of the mystery. Something about it did not sit quite right. She had untangled the lies, seen through the false confessions and desperate betrayals, and yet a whisper of doubt lingered in her mind, as faint as a draught through an old house. With a thoughtful sigh, she set her knitting aside and reached for the decanter of brandy, the very one that had sat untouched throughout the night's ordeal. Lifting it to the light, she studied the amber liquid, its surface smooth and unbroken. Ainsley's glass had been poisoned, but the bottle itself had never been tampered with. That much they had confirmed. So how had the poison been administered? The simplest answer had been the correct one, or so it had seemed. Eleanor had poured the drink. Ainsley had taken the fall, but Miss Marple had long since learned that simplicity was not always truth, and guilt was not always so neatly assigned. Her fingers traced the rim of the bottle. There was something about the sequence of events that felt arranged, not by chance, not by desperation, but by design. She stood, moving to the fireplace where the embers still glowed faintly. Her mind replayed the evening's events, each moment clicking into place like a well-set trap. Eleanor had poured the drink. Ainsley had ensured she did. And yet, the true poison had been in the perception of guilt. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. There was something she had missed. A detail, small but significant, hiding in plain sight. She thought back to the moment Ainsley had been led away. The look in his eyes, not fear, not regret, not even defiance. Satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of a man caught, but of one who had played his final move, and won. Miss Marple let out a breath, suddenly feeling the weight of the evening settle upon her. The case had not been about a single murder. It had been about control. Ainsley had orchestrated every piece of this, right up to the very end. He had turned Eleanor into his pawn, manipulated the narrative, ensured that the truth, whatever it truly was, would never fully come to light. Even if they caught him, would it matter? His plan had already taken root, and its consequences would continue long after the case was closed. A quiet knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She turned as the butler stepped in, his usual stoic expression betrayed by a flicker of unease. "A letter, madam. It was left at the front door not long ago." Miss Marple accepted it, unfolding the crisp parchment. The handwriting was unmistakable. Ainsley. The note was brief. "Truth is such a fickle thing, Miss Marple. You see what is there, but do you see what is missing? I do wonder." Her fingers tightened around the paper. The case was not over. Not truly. There was more to the story. Another layer beneath the surface. And as she stared at the flickering embers, she knew one thing for certain. A mystery never truly ends. It simply waits.